Hello and welcome to today's episode of the Out of the Lab podcast. Today I'm joined with Melinda Bachini, a well known advocate for cell and gene therapies. Melinda, welcome to the show.
Thank you. So happy to be here.
The first question I have for you, Melinda, is about through your experience and your perspective on the current sort of operational barriers to access in cell and gene therapy from like the patient's perspective. What is sort of holding it back from helping more people?
Well, I will tell you, it's been 13 years since I accessed cell therapy through a clinical trial at the National Cancer Institute. And I would say that for most cancer patients, that's still the only way to get access to cell therapy is through clinical trials. And also, I will say I'm from Billings, Montana. And when I was diagnosed with cholangiocarcinoma 16 years ago, there wasn't a lot of access to clinical trials, period, or experts in cholangiocarcinoma. So being from a rural state without access to many things, I realized how much people had to fight to get access to any kind of treatments. And I will say that for me, the only reason I was able to access cell therapy was because there was a clinical trial at the National Cancer Institute. It was federally funded. So the cost of, I didn't have to worry about my insurance coverage covering it. And they also covered the cost of me traveling from Billings, Montana to Bethesda, Maryland throughout this clinical trial process. So that helped me to access it because if that wasn't put into place, there's no way I would have put my family into financial hardship to even be able to do this, which isn't fair at all. So that's the biggest thing. I think it's location, geographical location. I think it's being in an area where there's academic institutions that are doing these kind of clinical trials or not being an area and not having access to it. And then this science takes forever to get approved because the same clinical trial, not the same one, but the same, the same science is still being researched at NCI that I did 13 years ago. And I just wish that science moved faster. Excited to see that there's more clinical trials being done across the country in different institutions. And excited to see that there's more approvals. Melanoma just had an FDA approval now for TIL therapy. So that makes me super happy too. But yeah, for all the solid tumors and GI tumors and stuff like that, still waiting, for those to have or patients to have access outside of a clinical trial.
Okay, so it sounds like the clinical trials they really help in the US with actual accessibility. So, I'm curious, do you think that there should be more clinical trials that are more accessible to, rural populations? Is that the sort of move forward here or like it sounds like it's a lot of work to like from you to to Maryland from Montana. That's pretty far. So, yeah, I'd
Yeah.
love to hear about that.
Right. Except for with the cell therapies, right? It's so difficult to manufacture these cell therapies. It's so individualized to each patient that it would be almost impossible to have these trials, pop up in community settings or rural locations. But I think the answer is finding ways to get patients to those settings where they're, not available. And again, for me, the National Cancer Institute was the answer because I will say that I didn't even know that NIH existed 16 years ago when I was diagnosed, which is funny because I remember writing papers in college and citing them as a resource, but not really understanding the full picture of what NIH and the NCI actually does. And until I was left with absolutely no options and stumbled upon this clinical trial, that's only when I really understood and went out there what was available. So, yes, I would love to see access in rural settings. I just don't think it's going to be possible with these cell therapies till they find a way to make the manufacturing easier to access and, and to be able to put it into these rural settings. But I really would love to work on a way of getting the patients to a setting where the costs were covered and it just made it easier for patients to participate. Not an easy therapy to go through, but for me, I mean, it's a one-time treatment and a lot to go through, but when it works, man, it's such a game changer.
Yeah. So, when we talk about like the patient impact on travel, there's a few that come to mind like you probably need support from someone else who would have to take time. You have to take the time as a patient. There's the actual financial costs. Like moving forward, what do you see as the top what would be the biggest impact of those various burdens on travel to to the patient's perspective?
Yeah. Well, one, it's not only the patient, it's the caregiver, right? Usually
Hmm.
you have a caregiver that goes with you too. So there's time off of work, there's daycare. I was a mother of six, still am a mother of six. But at the time I went through this treatment, we still had four that were in school, and we had to arrange daycare for people to come. For me, it was 3 weeks in hospital, not counting the surgery I had to have prior where they removed tumor to harvest the T cells. And so that was huge, is finding someone who could take care of our family while my husband and I went and sought care and treatment. So definitely access, the travel access, the expenses, but not just for the patient, for the caregiver, and then looking at the whole picture for the family. Because cancer just doesn't affect one person, it affects the whole family. So there's a lot of financial obstacles that have to be considered going into this. And that is the difficulty of clinical trials. Not all clinical trials have, financial support to help patients get to them.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. No one is operating sort of on their own out there, and yeah, wow. So it sounds like decentralized manufacturing, like that would make a big, like a real big difference if you had access. If you didn't have to fly across the country, like that
Right.
would, yeah.
That would be amazing, right? Have your cells manufactured, grown, and then shipped to you where you were so you didn't have to worry about traveling clear across the country like I did and being away from your family for that long of a period of time.
Yeah, it sounds like one of the challenges there, like blood draws can happen in many places, but it's the reinfusion and the manufacturing. So it sounds like that might be the sort of, yeah, the sort of
Yeah.
next frontier.
Yes, definitely the manufacturing, but then also being in a facility that can manage these therapies and the side effects that go along with them. Like I know for me, it was very comforting to know that I was in hospital right next to the ICU so that if there was any serious side effects, I could be moved immediately. So also making sure you're in have the right institution that can take care of the needs that are available.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, I'm not sure if you have a perspective on this, but I'm curious as there's a number of companies that are, creating products in this sort of space right now. Given your experience at sort of one of these earlier stage clinical trials, if you might have a particular perspective on what these companies might, maybe they should be thinking about that they're not, for example, or maybe from the patient's perspective, they like a product. Yeah, how could this be better? This whole thing, the being a patient in a clinical trial.
Oh, there's so many things. One, I think the companies should always start with having a patient voice, patient representative, a patient advocate weighing in on the design of the trials and on the research and on creating patient facing materials, all of that. There should always be a patient representative involved from the very beginning. I think that helps with so many things and helps it to be successful for both sides, both the patients and the company. Two, just thinking through, I totally had it on the tip of my tongue and now I forgot what I was going to say. Um, the patient voice was definitely one thing. I mean, I was just thinking, and I'm an expert at cholangiocarcinoma. I'm not an expert at all cancers, but I definitely can, I think, bring the patient voice to it. But I feel like we can improve this process. So for me, when I was first diagnosed, I had a large tumor in my liver and they removed that tumor. But at that time, it would be so good to forward think of, oh, maybe we could grow those cells at that point in case of a recurrence because this cancer has a high rate of recurrence.
Hmm.
Just thinking forward of the what ifs, and we could have been ready for it. For me, it came back 3 months later in my lungs. And I'm like, oh, they had that huge tumor with access to all these tumor infiltrating lymphocytes at that time that we could have maybe grown and been ready for instead of having to go back to harvest more, which I'm sure they do anyway to compare. But just thinking ahead of, maybe adjuvant therapy and neoadjuvant therapy and how it would work. But then thinking of that also of those cancers with high recurrence rate, why not grow the cells and give them to me right away to keep the cancer away, to put those cells back in. So if those cancer cells come back, they could, get rid of them right away to keep that recurrence from coming back. So there's so many things that I'm thinking of that we could do preventatively after surgery. And then one of my biggest pet peeves is having to progress on standard of care before you can enter into one of these trials.
What does that mean?
So for most cancers, there's a standard of care that's approved, right? Guidelines, you have to go through first line therapy first, right? It's gone through clinical trials, it's been proven. But again, I'll go back to cholangiocarcinoma. There's no curative option, and the standard of care was nothing to jump up and down about. But I had to show that I progressed on it before I could enter into a trial. And I'd love to just get rid of that option. I feel like patients should have the opportunity to enter into something that's a little more high risk, high reward. But if it works, it's such a game changer. And if it doesn't work, that chemo isn't going anywhere. That standard of care is still there, and then you could fall back onto it. But you're in a better position health wise, physically, your body to go into this to, in my mind, have a better chance at success than failing so many treatments down the road and then being able to enter into it. So those are two things that, yeah, were on the tip of my tongue that I lost for a moment, which I blame on chemo.
Yeah, I mean that makes a lot of sense. And yeah, so one thing I'm curious about is what is it like a legal barrier? Like what yeah, what actually
Oh,
prevents
yeah, there's an ethical standard, I guess, of they can't offer you an experimental therapy not knowing, then not having it FDA approved before you go through something that's already gone through that rigorous scientific process and FDA approval. There's, I don't know. There's a lot of patient advocacy groups who are working on inclusion, exclusion criteria and try to having the ability to change some of those things. But like with most trials, there is inclusion and exclusion criteria that you have to meet before you can enter into them. And that's part of it.
that makes sense. So I'm sort of curious about your perspective on, mentioned you could take tumor cells and you can repurpose them. You can use them for a lot of different things. Yeah, I'd love to hear a bit more about like what that could look like. I think you mentioned sort of like banking them in case in case of recurrence. Is this standard? Is that happening now?
I don't know. I don't know for sure, but I would like to think so. And especially, when I think of myself, again, I'm 9 years out since my last treatment, but I am hoping that if something came back, I could go back and grow my cells and do it again because I would do it again in a heartbeat. I went through the cell treatment twice. The first time around, it was bulk TIL, where they pulled the T cells from my tumor, grew it in bulk, and then gave it to me. And I was the first person with a GI cancer to ever have a response. And then the second time around, they grew the specific T cells that were reactive to one of my mutations. So it was more of a specific T cell treatment, and I had a much bigger response. And that worked for 3 years until the cancer wanted to block my immune system. And then I had to have the PD-L1 drug, which all along the way, this science has been changing and they've been changing the protocol and amending the clinical trial. So now they actually give a PD-1 drug in conjunction with the cell therapies. But then I had to do the PD-L1 drug for like 8 doses. And that's the last treatment I had 3 years ago. So once a year, I'll get scans and blood work, but the thought never leaves my mind that this cancer has a high recurrence rate. And somewhere down the line, I want to know that there's cells in a bank that I could go back to. If it grew, I would go back and do the process all over again in a heartbeat because it was worth it. But it would be nice to know that there is something there waiting.
Well, that sounds like it would really give you like a sense of peace of mind.
Yes.
That's
Yes, for
wow.
sure.
Yeah, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Since you were sort of one of the early, you're a sort of pioneer in this particular treatment. I'm curious, have you seen? Surely it was probably more difficult as an early sort of adopter than later. Have things changed? Has accessibility for this particular type of treatment gotten better over the past few years?
I've definitely seen more clinical trials, so there's more access, more institutions doing this research and therapy. So definitely more access across the country, where before I think NCI was the only place you could get it. I definitely have seen lots of improvements. Like I said, there's been so many amendments made to these trials over the years. Learning it's never fast enough for me. I want to see the science move faster, and it's so personalized. Like at the NCI, they can only treat so many patients a month because it's in hospital for so long. So it feels like it moves at a snail's pace, and I just want to see it go faster. but I definitely have seen improvements. I just wish they could all come together under one roof and make it go a whole lot faster.
So, thinking a little bit about the sort of speed, like when you were, when it was in your time, was it? Did you have to wait a long time to get in when
No.
they set that up?
No, I was so fortunate. I don't know. I say there was a miracle involved there, just the way it all took place. I literally had just stopped chemo because my quality of life was so poor. I was about 2 years into my diagnosis, and it was a stage 4 terminal diagnosis. I had tumors all over both my lungs and all over my liver, and I made the decision that I wanted quality over quantity and stopped all treatment. And I literally sat down at my computer one day and stumbled upon this clinical trial. I wasn't looking, it just popped up. And I remember reading it and thinking, okay, it has the initial chemo for a week to wipe out your immune system, and I can do anything for a week. And then it's your immune system doing what it's supposed to be doing. And I remember looking at my husband thinking, or telling him, I think we should try this. I think we should try this. I don't think we have anything to lose. And we did the work. Like, we called out there, we got the appointment set up, we sent the scans. My husband is a nurse practitioner. He drew my blood at the kitchen table. Like, we just did all the work to make it happen. And our local oncologist here, of course, was very supportive, but he's like, I'll support you in whatever you want to do. But we typically work with the University of Denver for clinical trials because that's what Billings, Montana is close to. And I
Mhm.
said, no, I really want to give this a shot. And yeah, and so we did. And so I was very fortunate. I was able to get out there like within 3 to 4 weeks, accepted into the trial, had the surgery. They grew the cells a whole lot faster back then than they did. I think there's the waiting time is a little longer, but I was able to receive my cells like 4 weeks after surgery. They grew fast enough and grew enough. And so it was amazing. I went in with a chronic cough because I had so many tumors. I couldn't talk more than a sentence without coughing. I couldn't walk more than 5 steps without coughing. And by the end of that 3 weeks in the hospital after receiving my cells, that cough went away. And I was like, oh, something's working. And, they were like very cautiously optimistic. And, well, we'll have to see. And I'm like, oh no, I know there's something going on here. And sure enough, it shrank for 6 months. Then it stayed stable and then it started growing. And then that's when they went back and retreated me with this specific T cell to target that mutation. And second time around, again, same thing, but I had a much bigger response. And it's a one-time treatment. And my quality of life was so, so good afterwards. And I just want them to figure out how to make it work for everyone.
Wow, that is a truly amazing story. Well,
Yeah,
yeah.
it was. I'm telling you, I sometimes I still pinch myself because now I go to these big scientific cancer conferences, and Dr. Rosenberg is a pretty darn big deal, and he'll be presenting, and my slide will pop up with patient MB, and oh, it's so surreal to realize that he's talking about me. And then they published the story in the Science Journal on the data, and then personally, they did a story on my family in the New York Times, and it went around the world. In that first week, I had hundreds of phone calls from patients all over the world
Wow,
just wanting to know there was a possibility that they could access this treatment. And that was when my love for patient advocacy was born.
that is amazing. Well, thank you so much for sharing your story on the show today.
Thank
Yeah,
you for having me. I
pleasure.
appreciate it so much.